At 35, I never imagined an 18-year-old could leave such an indelible mark on my life. The events of that summer evening changed everything, etching a memory I can never erase. It began on a warm, fragrant evening, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass, the sky a canvas of orange hues. I'd just collected my usual espresso from the corner coffee shop, a small, comforting ritual in my otherwise monotonous routine. Stepping outside, the gentle breeze against my face, I noticed him. He leaned casually against a street lamp a few feet away, arms crossed, exuding an undeniable magnetism. Something about his demeanor was captivating, impossible to ignore. His posture was relaxed, almost arrogant, yet his eyes were sharp, inquisitive, as if he could peer directly into my soul. He couldn't have been older than 18, but he possessed a confidence that belied his age. I hadn't intended to stare, but there was something mesmerizing about him. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight highlighted the golden streaks in his dark hair, or the sharp angle of his jaw that gave him an older appearance. Or maybe it was the quiet self-assurance in his stance, as if he ruled the world yet disregarded its constraints. Whatever it was, I felt a pull in my chest I hadn't experienced in years, a curiosity, a spark I couldn't explain. Before I could avert my gaze, he caught my eye and smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that sent a jolt through me. Then he started walking towards me. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, deep, laced with a playful lilt. "Do you have the time?" I glanced at my watch, my mind struggling to process the simple request. It's 6:15. "Perfect," he replied, his smile widening. "I'm supposed to meet someone here, but I'm a bit early. Mind if I wait with you?" I should have declined. I should have walked away and left him to his own devices. But something about him, his confidence, his effortless charm, made it impossible to refuse. So I nodded, and we sat together on the bench outside the coffee shop, the warm evening air enveloping us like a comforting blanket. He introduced himself as Aaron. Over the next half hour, we talked about everything and nothing. He spoke of his passion for sketching, how he spent hours drawing scenes of places he'd never visited, and his dream of traveling the world. There was an openness about him, a raw honesty that was both refreshing and disarming. In turn, I found myself sharing things I hadn't spoken about in years. My love for music, my regrets about roads not taken, the feeling that life was passing me by. "You're interesting," he said suddenly, leaning back against the bench, his eyes sparkling with a mixture of curiosity and mischief. "Most people around here are so predictable, but you're different." I laughed, unsure why. "Different? How?" "I don't know," he replied, his gaze lingering on mine. "Like you got a story worth telling, but you're too scared to share it." The comment struck me more deeply than it should have. He was just a kid. What could he possibly know about my life, my struggles? But there was something in his tone, a disconcerting accuracy, that made it impossible to dismiss. As the minutes stretched into an hour, it became clear his friend wasn't coming, or so he claimed. When he finally stood up, he shrugged. "Looks like I got stood up," he said, his voice tinged with mock disappointment. "Guess I'll have to find some other way to spend my evening." There was an unspoken question in his words, an invitation hanging in the air between us. I hesitated, the logical part of my mind urging me to leave. But then he tilted his head, his smile returning, and I felt that pull in my chest again. "You're not busy, are you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Let's grab a bite. My treat. And, just like that, I found myself sitting across from him in a small diner down the street, the aroma of frying food and freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The place was almost deserted, the kind of hole in the wall where time seemed to stand still. We shared a basket of fries and talked like old friends, despite having only just met. Aaron had a way of drawing you in, making you feel like the only person in the world who mattered. He spoke of his frustrations with small-town life, how he felt trapped and yearned for something more. His dreams of escaping to a big city, of seeing the world, were so vivid I almost felt like I was experiencing them alongside him. "You ever feel like you're just existing?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "Like there's so much more out there, but you're stuck in this endless loop?" "Yeah," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. "I think everyone feels that way at some point." He smiled, but it was different this time. Smaller, quieter. "Maybe, but not everyone does something about it." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I looked down at my coffee cup, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. He had a way of cutting through the noise, getting straight to the heart of things, leaving you feeling exposed. "Why'd you stop chasing your dreams?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "What made you give up?" I didn't have an answer, at least not one I could articulate. Instead, I shrugged and mumbled something about responsibilities and the way life didn't always go as planned. He didn't press me, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied with my answer. As the night progressed, I found myself forgetting about the age difference, about the fact that I barely knew him. There was an ease between us, a connection that felt both unexpected and natural. When we finally left the diner, the streets were quiet, the hum of streetlights the only sound in the cool night air. He walked me to my car, hands shoved in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. Reaching the driver's side door, he leaned against it, his gaze locking with mine. "Thanks for tonight," he said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. There was a palpable tension in the air, a pull that was impossible to ignore. I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined, but the way his eyes lingered on mine made my heart race. He smiled then, that same mischievous curve of his lips that had initially drawn me in. "See you around," he said, stepping back and shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. I watched him walk away, his silhouette fading into the shadows, and felt a strange mix of relief and longing. As I drove home, his words echoed in my mind, "It's never too late." But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Something had shifted that night, something I couldn't quite articulate. Deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every detail replayed in my head. The way Aaron's smile had lingered just a little too long, the spark in his eyes that seemed to illuminate the darkness, the unspoken tension between us as he walked away. It was maddening. I barely knew him, yet he'd managed to get under my skin like no one else ever had. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a strange but fleeting encounter that would fade with time. But days passed, and he remained lodged in my mind like a splinter. By the end of the week, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about him, until I saw him again. It was early evening, and I was leaving the grocery store, a bag of essentials tucked under my arm, when I heard a familiar voice call out, "Hey, stranger!" I turned to see him leaning against the side of the building, arms crossed, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. He looked even more relaxed this time, his hair slightly tousled, his shirt hanging loosely off one shoulder. "You following me?" I joked, though my pulse quickened at the sight of him. "Maybe," he said with a shrug, his grin widening. "Or maybe I just have impeccable timing." I rolled my eyes, trying to feign indifference, but I couldn't suppress the smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you, apparently." He stepped closer, his eyes locking with mine. "Fate works in mysterious ways, doesn't it?" I laughed nervously, shifting the grocery bag in my arms. "If you say so." "Let me carry that," he said, reaching for the bag before I could protest. His fingers brushed mine, sending a jolt through me, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "It's fine," I stammered, but he was already walking ahead, the bag in his hand as if it weighed nothing. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "I'll walk you to your car." I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. There was an ease to his movements, a confidence that made it impossible to look away. As we reached my car, he set the bag down on the trunk and leaned against it, his gaze steady. "Why are you really here?" I asked, my voice quieter now. He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Maybe I just wanted to see you again." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. There was something in his tone, something unguarded and honest that left me momentarily speechless. "You're different," he said, his voice softer now. "Most people don't even notice me. But you see me." I swallowed hard, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "Aaron, I don't—" He interrupted, stepping closer, his gaze unwavering. The space between us seemed to shrink with every passing second. "Don't overthink it. Just let it happen." And then, before I could say another word, he kissed me. It was quick, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send my world spinning. His lips were soft and warm, and for a moment, all the noise in my head disappeared. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine as if waiting for me to say something. "I shouldn't," I began, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of my age? Because you think it's wrong? Or because you're scared?" I looked away, my chest tightening. "It's complicated. Life's always complicated," he said, his tone steady. "But that doesn't mean you run from it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. I was scared. Scared of what this could mean. Scared of what people would think. Scared of feeling something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. But more than that, I was scared of him. Of how easily he seemed to dismantle the walls I had spent so long building around myself. "Let me in," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a plea. "Just for a little while." I didn't respond, but the look in my eyes must have betrayed me, because he smiled, a small, almost triumphant smile that made my knees weak. Before I knew it, we were back in my car. Driving aimlessly through our quiet town, conversation flowed easily, drifting from topic to topic, yet the unspoken tension between us hung heavy in the air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold, Aaron leaned his head back against the seat. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "All the time," I admitted, surprised by my own candor. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Then why don't you change it?" "Because it's not that simple," I replied, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "It is," he insisted. "You just have to decide what you want and go after it." His words resonated long after I dropped him off. I told myself it would end there, that I wouldn't let myself get drawn into whatever this was. Yet, the following day, I found myself outside the coffee shop, hoping to see him. When he appeared, grinning like he'd anticipated my presence, I knew I was in trouble. Our encounters became more frequent. A stolen hour here, a late-night drive there. We never discussed what it meant or where it was leading. We just let it unfold. With each passing day, the tension between us intensified, like a coiled spring on the verge of snapping. It wasn't long before things escalated. Parked on the edge of the town one night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Aaron reached over and placed his hand on mine. The simple gesture sent my heart racing. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." I turned to him, my throat dry. "Aaron, this isn't—" "Stop," he interrupted, his gaze intense. "Stop thinking about what's right or wrong. Just be here with me." Before I could reply, he leaned in and kissed me. This kiss was different, deep and consuming, the kind that left you breathless and wanting more. My hands found their way to his face, pulling him closer, and for a moment, the world outside the car vanished. But as the intensity of the moment surged, so did the weight of our actions. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and desire. "Tell me you feel this too," he whispered. I couldn't deny it any longer. "I do." "Then don't run," he said, his hand still on mine. "We can figure this out together." I nodded, my chest tight with a blend of fear and longing. I didn't know where this was going, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was him, his touch, his smile, his unwavering belief that this, whatever it was worth fighting for. Driving home, the weight of reality settled upon me. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something that could unravel everything. Deep down, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Little did I know, the real challenges were yet to come. The more time I spent with Aaron, the harder it became to control my emotions. What began as fleeting encounters had deepened into something profound, something I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Each moment with him was a tug-of-war between exhilaration and fear, between surrender and resistance. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself this was temporary, a mistake, I kept returning to him. He had a hold on me, one I couldn't break. One evening, as the late summer heat yielded to a cool breeze, Aaron called. His voice was calm, yet there was an underlying edge. "Can you come over?" he asked. "I need to talk to you." The request was simple, but the weight of his words sent a shiver down my spine. Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys. The drive to his house felt longer than ever. When I arrived, he was sitting on the front steps, head tilted back, gazing at the sky. The porch light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. "You look like you've been thinking too much," I said, attempting levity. He glanced at me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe I have." I sat beside him. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. After a moment, he turned to me, his expression serious. "I can't keep doing this if it's not real," he said, quietly but firmly. "I need to know where you stand." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I swallowed hard. "Aaron, it's not that simple." "It is that simple," he interrupted, his gaze locking onto mine. "Either this means something to you, or it doesn't. I'm not a kid, no matter how much you might want to see me that way. I know what I want. The question is, do you?" His words hit me hard, forcing me to confront feelings I'd been suppressing. I'd been so caught up in the intensity of our connection that I hadn't allowed myself to consider what it all meant. But now, sitting beside him, I couldn't avoid it any longer. "It means something," I admitted softly, "more than I can even explain." For the first time since I'd arrived, his expression softened. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me. "Then stop fighting it," he said steadily. "Stop trying to convince yourself that it's wrong because it doesn't feel wrong to me." I couldn't argue with him, not when he looked at me like that, not when every fiber of my being urged me to let go of my fears and just be with him. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was both urgent and tender. His response was immediate, his hands cupping my face as he deepened the kiss, pulling me closer. The world seemed to dissolve as we sat there on the steps, lost in each other. His touch was electric, his kisses both soft and demanding, and for the first time in years I felt completely alive. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm on my skin. "I've wanted to do that all day," he admitted, a grin spreading across his face. I chuckled softly, my hand still resting on his shoulder. "You're impossible, you know that." "Maybe," he said, his grin widening, "but you like it." I couldn't deny it. Not anymore. The lines I'd so carefully drawn between us had blurred beyond recognition, and the thought of walking away now felt unbearable. But as much as I wanted to stay in that moment forever, I knew it wasn't that simple. "We need to talk about this," I said hesitantly, "about what we're doing, what it means." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "We can talk, but first, come inside." I followed him into the house. The air inside was cool and quiet. He led me to his room, where the faint scent of cologne lingered. It was a simple space, clean and uncluttered, with a few personal touches that hinted at who he was. A sketch pad lay open on the desk, and I couldn't help but glance at the intricate drawing he'd been working on. "You're really good," I said, gesturing to the sketch. "Thanks," he said softly. "It's one of the few things that helps me clear my head." We sat down on the edge of his bed, the tension between us building again as the silence stretched. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of his touch. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, unsure how to articulate my feelings. "I'm scared," I admitted finally, "of what this means, of what people will say, of how it'll change things." "It doesn't have to change anything," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "This is about us, not anyone else. And the only thing that matters is how we feel." I looked at him, his eyes full of conviction, and felt a wave of emotion wash over me. He was right. This wasn't about the outside world or the expectations I'd placed on myself. This was about him, about us, and the connection we shared. Without thinking, I leaned in again, our lips meeting in a kiss that was both passionate and desperate. We couldn't control ourselves, our bodies drawn to each other like magnets. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else. Our bodies intertwined, our hearts beating as one. The feel of his skin against mine, the sound of his breath mingling with my own, it was intoxicating, and I didn't want it to end. We delved deeper, our love consuming us. Every touch ignited a fire that threatened to burn us both. I felt his warmth, his love, and his longing as we lost ourselves in each other. Our love became an all-consuming force. We were no longer two people, we were one, united in our passion. The world around us melted away, leaving only the two of us, lost in our desire. But as the night wore on, the reality of our situation began to creep back in. We were playing with fire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up to us. As much as I wanted to believe we could keep this between us, the truth was far more complicated. "We can't keep this a secret forever," I murmured, my voice trembling. "People will find out eventually." "Let them," he said defiantly. "I'm not ashamed of how I feel, and you shouldn't be either." His words were brave, but they only heightened my fears. I knew how unforgiving the world could be, how quickly people turned on you when you didn't fit their idea of what was right. And yet, looking into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to let go. "I don't want to lose this," I whispered. "You won't," he promised, his hand tightening around mine. "As long as we're honest with each other, we'll figure it out." It was a promise I wanted to believe, but deep down, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Still, in that moment, with his arms around me and his heartbeat steady against mine, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to make this work. But as I left his house that night, the weight of our choices settled over me like a heavy fog. The world outside felt colder, harsher, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the connection we shared, I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my mind whispering that this was only the beginning of the challenges we would face. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. My mind was constantly at war with itself, half of me consumed by the feelings Aaron awakened in me, and the other half haunted by the potential consequences. Each time my phone buzzed with a message from him, my heart would leap, only to sink under the weight of my growing anxiety. We began to meet more frequently, stealing moments where we could. Sometimes it was as simple as grabbing coffee and talking about our days. Other times it was late-night drives to inside the car, filled with the sound of music and a palpable unspoken tension. Our connection was undeniable. Yet, so was the risk. I understood we were treading a precarious path, each step feeling more uncertain than the one before. The night brought a hush, the usual bustle replaced by the occasional jogger or a couple strolling with their dog. He was already there when I pulled up, leaning against a tree, arms crossed. The sight of him, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, sent a familiar tightness through my chest. "You look tired," he commented as I approached. "Long day," I responded, forcing a smile. "Well," he said, reaching for my hand, "I'll make it better." His touch was anchoring, a small act of comfort that I desperately craved. We walked the meandering paths of the park, our conversation drifting from one subject to the next. He spoke of his sketches, his desire to capture the essence of places he'd never seen. I talked about the pressures of my job, the expectations that weighed me down like an anchor. Somehow, he always knew the right words to ease the burden. "Have you ever considered just letting it all go?" he asked quietly. "Letting go?" I echoed, unsure of his meaning. "Yeah," he said, stopping to face me. "All the expectations, all the rules you think you have to follow. What if you just lived for yourself for once?" His words hung in the air, a challenge I wasn't sure I was prepared to meet. I looked away, the rustling leaves and the gentle breeze a welcome distraction. "It's not that simple," I finally said. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," he replied, his voice soft but firm. We settled onto a bench near the park's edge, enveloped by the quiet sounds of the night. Aaron leaned back, his head tilted towards the sky, and sighed. "I don't get you," he said after a moment. "What do you mean?" "You're so strong, so confident in so many ways," he said, turning to look at me. "But when it comes to what you want, you act like you're afraid to go for it." His words stung, but I couldn't dispute them. I'd spent so much of my life striving to meet everyone else's expectations that I'd forgotten to listen to my own heart. "Maybe I am scared," I admitted. "Scared of what people will think. Scared of losing everything I've worked for." Aaron reached for my hand again, his grip firm yet gentle. "You can't live your life for other people," he said. "At some point you have to decide what's more important, what they think, or what makes you happy." It was a simple truth, but hearing it from him made it feel profound. I looked at him, his eyes filled with an honesty that left me breathless, and felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble. That night, we didn't speak much more. Instead, we sat in comfortable silence, his hand clasped in mine. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes. For the first time, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as impossible as I'd believed. But the world has a way of intruding on even the most perfect moments. It wasn't long before cracks appeared in our carefully constructed bubble. It began with whispers, comments from colleagues, sideways glances from neighbors. At first, I dismissed them as paranoia, but it soon became evident that people were taking notice of the time Aaron and I spent together. One day, as I left the coffee shop, a colleague stopped at me. "Hey, can I ask you something?" she said, her tone casual but her expression anything but. "Sure," I replied, my chest tightening with apprehension. "Who's that kid you're always with? I've seen you two around a lot lately." The question seemed innocent enough, but it felt like a blow. My mind raced for a response, something that wouldn't invite further inquiry. "He's just a friend," I said quickly. "Someone I'm mentoring." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but didn't push further. The encounter left me shaken, and for the first time I truly grasped how fragile our situation was. When I told Aaron about it that evening, his reaction was a mixture of frustration and defiance. "Who cares what they think?" he said, pacing back and forth across my living room. "It's none of their business." "Maybe not," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But that doesn't mean they won't talk. And if this gets out—" "If this gets out what?" he interrupted, his tone sharp. "You'll lose your job? Your reputation? Is that what you're so afraid of?" "Yes," I admitted, the words catching in my throat. "And it's not just about me. It's about you too. If people find out, they'll judge you, Aaron. They'll see you as some mistake I made." He stopped pacing, his expression softening as he looked at me. "Is that what you think this is? A mistake?" "No," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "But that's how they'll see it, and I can't protect you from that." "I don't need your protection," he said, stepping closer. "What I need is for you to stop hiding, to stop pretending this doesn't matter." His words struck me deeply, and for a moment I couldn't speak. He was right. I was hiding from the world and from myself, but the fear of what we stood to lose was overwhelming. "I don't know how to do this," I finally whispered. "You don't have to know," he said, his voice gentler now. "You just have to try." And so we tried. For weeks, we navigated the complexities of our relationship as best we could, balancing the intense pull we felt toward each other with the ever-present fear of discovery. We found solace in stolen moments, in the quiet corners of our lives where no one could see us. But the weight of secrecy began to take its toll, and the cracks in our resolve grew harder to ignore. One night, as we sat and parked in my car on the edge of town, Aaron turned to me with an unfamiliar expression, a blend of sorrow and resolve. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Hiding, sneaking around. It's not enough anymore." His words tightened my chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to make a choice," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Either we stop running and face this together, or we let it go." The thought of letting him go was agonizing, but so was the idea of exposing ourselves to the inevitable judgment and scrutiny. I looked at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights, and knew I couldn't lose him. "I want to fight for this," I said, my voice firm despite the fear coursing through me. "For us." A small smile broke through his sadness, and he reached for my hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "Then we fight," he said simply. It wouldn't be easy. I understood that. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges we couldn't yet foresee. But as we sat there, our fingers intertwined, I felt a glimmer of hope. Because no matter what happened next, we had each other. And that, I realized, was worth everything.